The summer I turned 19 was the last summer I ever swam in the quarry, and it took me a long time to understand that the water hadn't done anything to me at all. It had done it to Deke. I only watched. But watching, I've come to believe, is its own kind of drowning. The slow kind, the kind that keeps you up at 3 in the morning 40 years on, listening to your own breathing, and wondering if it sounds like a man treading water. We called it the quarry, though nobody had cut stone out of it in living memory. It was a flooded pit off the old Elk Fork Road, a place the county had long since stopped pretending to care about, and by the time my generation found it, the walls had softened with moss, and the water had gone the deep bottle green of something very old and very still. There was a spring somewhere down in the dark of it. You could feel it if you swam out to the middle and let your legs hang. The top 3 or 4 feet were warm as bathwater by late July, warm as the air, and then your toes would find the line where the cold began. And it wasn't a gradual thing. It was a wall. Cross it, and the cold closed over your feet like a hand slipping a glove on, and every hair on your body stood up at once. We had a name for that layer, though we didn't know the real word for it then. We called it the floor, because it felt solid, felt like something you could stand on if you were fool enough to try. Deck was my cousin on my mother's side, a year older than me, and built like a fence post, all knuckles and elbows, and that Elk Fork stubbornness that ran in the family thick as creek mud. He'd grown up half in the water. We all had. There wasn't much else to do out our way, but swim and work and get into the kind of small trouble that felt enormous at the time, and turned out not to matter at all. Deke mattered, though. Deke was the one who'd pull you up when you got a cramp, the one who swam out furthest and dove down deepest, and always came back up, grinning with something to prove. So when he stood on the lip of the quarry that evening and swore up and down that the pool had a bottom, that he'd touched it once and would touch it again, none of us doubted he'd try. We only doubted the bottom. There's no bottom to a flooded quarry that a boy can reach on one breath. I know that now, and I half knew it then. Those pits go down 40, 60, 100 feet, straight walls, and black water and cold that would stop your heart before your lungs ever got the chance to fill. But Deke had that light in him that evening, the reckless summer light that comes over young men when the days are long, and they haven't yet learned what the world is willing to take from them. The sun was going down behind the pines and coming through the trees, all amber and slow, laying gold bars across the green water, and Deke stripped to his shorts and stood there gilded like something off a church window, and he said, "Watch me." And we watched him. I remember the dive clean as anything I've ever seen. He cut the surface without a splash, the way he always could, and I watched his pale shape go down through the warm water into the gold light, kicking strong and even. He crossed the line. I saw the moment he crossed it, because his whole body changed, the way a body does when the cold hits, a kind of flinch and then a stiffening, and I waited for him to turn around the way you always did, to come clawing back up toward the warm and the air. He didn't turn around. He kept going down another stroke, maybe 2, into the dark below the shimmer, and then he stopped. He just stopped. His legs quit kicking. His arms drifted out from his sides, loose the way a sleeping man's arms drift, and he hung there in that cold layer, with the last of the light coming down around him and his head tilted. That's the part I've never been able to shake. His head tilted down toward the dark, not up toward us and the air and the gold evening, but down like something below had spoken to him, and he was leaning in to hear it better. He hung there, tilted and drifting and still, and the water was so clear. That evening I could see the pale oval of his face turned away from me, turned down into the black. The others were laughing. Somebody said he's showing off. Somebody else counted the seconds, like it was a contest. And I stood on the rock, with my feet in the warm shallows, and I could not for the life of me make my mouth work to laugh along, because I'd seen Deke hold his breath 1,000 times, and it never once looked like that. There was no strain in him. There was no fight. He looked the way a coat looks hanging on a nail, emptied out, waiting, and the longer he hung there, the more the laughing behind me thinned out until it stopped altogether. And the quarry got very quiet, just the crickets starting up in the tree line and the small slap of water against the rock. Then he came up. Not fast, not gasping. He rose slow and strange, and broke the surface without the big whooping breath you'd expect from a boy who'd been under that long. And he swam to the rocks with a stroke I didn't recognize, careful and stiff, and we hauled him out. His lips were gray, not blue the way cold makes them, gray, and his eyes had a look I can only call unfamiliar, like a man waking in a room he doesn't know. Somebody clapped him on the back and asked did he touch bottom, and Deke didn't answer right away. He sat on the warm rock in the last of the sun, and he rubbed his arms, hard, up and down, over and over, though the evening was hot enough that the rest of us were still sweating. He said the cold got my legs. He said it real quiet. He said I couldn't feel them, and then I couldn't feel deciding anything, and I don't remember choosing to come up. I just remember I was coming up. We laughed it off, most of us, because that's what you do at 19 when something has brushed too close to a thing you don't have words for. But I sat by him while the others went back to jumping and horsing around, and I watched him rub his arms raw, and I watched him watch the water. He wouldn't look away from it. Not the way you look at something you love, the way our whole family looked at that quarry. He looked at it the way you'd look at a dog that had bitten you once, that you had to keep in the yard, that you couldn't ever quite turn your back on again. That night, at my aunt's table, he wouldn't talk about it. My aunt asked how the swimming was, and Deke said fine and looked at his plate, and there was a set to his jaw that told the rest of us to leave it, so we left it. But I shared the back room with him that visit, and I woke sometime in the deep middle of the night to the sound of him awake in the other bed, breathing wrong. Slow and deliberate, in through the nose and hold and out, in and hold and out. The way you breathe when you're rationing air, when you're deep and you don't know how far you've got to go. I lay there and listened to my cousin breathe like a drowning man in a dry bed. And I didn't say anything, and after a long while it evened out and I slept. He never went back in the quarry, never went back in any water at all as it turned out. By August, he wouldn't wade the creek to check the trot lines. By the next summer, he'd flinch from a garden hose. My aunt took him to a doctor over in the county seat, who said it was nerves, and gave him something that made him sleep too much. And after that, nobody in the family talked about it directly, the way we didn't talk about a lot of things, the way you learn not to poke at the soft places. Deke grew up strange and quiet. He was still my cousin and I still loved him, but there was a distance in him now, a held breath, and he carried it the rest of his life. It was better than 40 years before he told me the rest of it, and by then we were both old men, and his hands shook when he held his coffee. We were sitting on his porch, and the talk had drifted the way old men's talk does, back and back. And I don't know what made me ask about the quarry after all that time. Maybe I'd been waiting my whole life to ask. He was quiet a long while. Then he said the cold grabbing his legs wasn't the thing. He'd let us believe that because it was a thing a person could say out loud. The real thing, he said, was that when he was hanging down there in the cold layer with the last light coming through, he'd looked down into the dark below him, and there'd been legs, he said. Pale legs, treading water, down there beneath him in the black, where no light reached and no bottom was. More than one pair. He couldn't say how many. They were down in the dark the way you'd see people standing in a room with the lamp off, just shapes paler than the black around them, and they were treading water slow and easy, keeping their place, and they were all faced up toward him, toward the light, toward the warm. He said the worst of it, the thing that had locked his body so he couldn't remember choosing to rise, was that he understood, hanging there, that there were more of them down below than there were of us up top. A whole quiet crowd of them, treading in the cold and the dark, patient as anything, and they had been there a very long time. He didn't say whose legs. I asked him, and he wouldn't say, and I've wondered ever since whether that meant he didn't know, or whether it meant he did. But he told me the last part with his eyes closed, and he said it soft, and he said it like he'd been carrying it up from a great depth his whole life, and was only now, at the end, able to break the surface with it. He said they'd been waiting a long time to have company. He said that when he'd started to rise, one of them had risen a little too, following him up toward the light, and had stopped at the line where the cold met the warm, unable or unwilling to cross it, and had hung there in the last of the gold, watching him go. And Deke said the thing he could never get out of him, the thing that had kept him breathing wrong in the dark for 40 years, was that the pale face turned up at him from below. The cold had not looked like a stranger's. He wouldn't say more than that. He died that winter, in his bed, dry and warm and old. And I like to think that's a mercy. But sometimes at 3 in the morning I lie awake and listen to my own breathing, slow and rationed in the dark, and I think about that quarry still out there off the Elk Fork Road, gone green and still, warm on the top and cold as a grave below. And I think about how the family always said there was no bottom to it. And I think about how they're still down there, treading slow in the dark, faced up toward a light that reaches them less every year, patient and waiting, and not near so lonely now as they used to be. My grandmother's place sat at the bottom of a long holler, where the light came late and left early, and the creek ran along the edge of her property, the way a road runs along the edge of a town, close enough to hear all night, far enough that you had to want to go to it. It was the kind of creek that had no name on any map, but had 6 or 7 names among the people who lived along it, depending on which bend you meant and whose grandfather had drowned there. Below my grandmother's the creek did a thing creeks do when the land lets them, spread out wide and went slow and deep in a bowl scooped out of the clay, and that was the swimming hole. That was where I spent every summer of my boyhood, and it is the reason I have not put my head underwater in 50 years. The water there was dark. I want you to understand it wasn't dirty, wasn't muddy the way floodwater is muddy. It was clear the way strong tea is clear, stained through with the brown of 1,000 autumns of leaves rotting down into it. Tannin, they call it. And it held the light the way a bottle of molasses holds it, letting a little through the top, and none at all past a certain depth. You'd wade out from the sandy shelf on the near bank, and the sand would drop away under your feet all at once into the deep part, and below your waist there was simply nothing to see. Your own legs vanished. You floated on top of a darkness that could have been 3 feet deep or 30, and as a boy I loved that more than I can say. I loved not knowing what was under me. I loved the mystery of it, the way you love a scary story when you're small and your grandmother's in the next room. It never once occurred to me that a mystery is only pleasant when you're certain of the answer. My grandmother told me 100 times not to swim there alone. She wasn't a fearful woman, and she didn't fuss over much. So when she was firm about a thing, you knew it had weight behind it. She'd say it plain, standing at the screen door with her hands still wet from the sink. "Don't you go to that water by yourself, you hear me?" And I'd say, "Yes, ma'am," and mean it, right up until the afternoon got long and hot, and the cicadas started their roaring up in the poplars. And there was nobody around to swim with, and the creek was right there, calling the way water calls a boy in July. I was 12 the evening it happened, old enough to know better, and young enough not to care, which is the most dangerous age a person is ever going to be. The light was doing that thing it did in the holler, where it goes thick and golden and slantwise, coming through the trees in bars, and the cicadas were so loud. They were less a sound than a pressure, a great throbbing wall of noise that pressed in on your ears until you almost couldn't think inside it. I remember that. I remember the noise, because it's the thing that changed. I waded out to the sandy shelf and felt the familiar drop-off under my toes and pushed out into the deep. And the water was warm on top and cool underneath, the way it always was. And I swam and floated and did the thing I loved best, which was to take a big breath and dive down into the dark and touch bottom and kick back up. Down there it was cold and black and silent. And the silence was the sweetest part, the way it shut out the cicadas all at once, like a door closing on the whole loud world. I dove twice and touched the smooth clay bottom both times and came up whooping and slinging water off my hair. The third time I dove, I went down at a little different angle, off toward the deep cut under the far bank, where the roots of a big sycamore came down into the water. And I reached out in the dark, the way you do, feeling for the bottom, and my hand closed on something that was not the bottom and was not a root. It was cloth. There is no mistaking cloth. A root is hard and slick and cold, and a sunk branch is rough. But this was soft, and it was woven. It moved under my fingers the way a shirt moves, water heavy and slow. And in the half-second, before my mind caught up to my hand, I had already gripped it. And inside the cloth there was something that gave. Not the hard give of wood, but the slow give of a thing that has a shape, a thing packed soft and firm together, and my fingers pressed into it and felt the length and the roundness of it, and it was a shoulder. I want to tell you I reasoned that out later, safe on the bank. I didn't. I knew it right then in the black and the cold, with the whole silent weight of that water on top of me. My hand was on a shoulder. There was cloth over it, and under the cloth a shoulder, and the shoulder did not move, and did not pull away, and did not do anything at all, except be there, patient, in the dark where no light had reached in 100 years. I don't remember letting go. I don't remember the swim up. The next thing I have is standing in the shallows on the sandy shelf, with the water at my knees and my whole body shaking so hard my teeth were going, and the cicadas roaring back in my ears louder than ever, and my hand, my right hand, held out in front of me like it belonged to somebody else, like I wanted it off me. I stood there a long time. The sun kept going down. I told myself things the way you do. I told myself it was a feed sack somebody dumped, swollen up with silt. I told myself it was a drowned deer, that the give I felt was just a deer gone soft in the water. I told myself root. I told myself trash. I told myself anything. And none of it stuck, because I had felt the shape of it, and the shape had an answer to it that my hand knew even if my mouth wouldn't say. It had felt like a shoulder, because it was one. I ran home. I ran up that path faster than I've ever run, and I burst through the screen door into the kitchen where my grandmother was. And I stopped, because I looked at her face, at that steady old face that didn't fuss and didn't fear, and I understood in a rush of cold that I could not tell her. And it wasn't only the fear of a whipping for swimming alone, though that was in it. It was two fears, side by side, and I couldn't have told you then which was bigger. I was afraid she'd look at me and say, "Child, you imagined it. You scared yourself down there in that dark water. There's nothing in that creek." And I was more afraid, so much more afraid, that she would not say that she would go still and quiet, the way she did about things with weight behind them, and she would look at me, and she would say something like, "I told you not to go to that water," as though she'd known, as though there was a reason. She'd said it 100 times that had nothing to do with drowning and everything to do with what was already down there, waiting, patient in the dark, in its cloth. So I said nothing. I said I was cold, and she gave me a look but let it be. And I went and sat in the back room shaking until supper. And I never told her, not that summer, not any summer after, not on her deathbed when she held my hand and asked, was there anything I needed to say to her before she went? There was. I didn't say it. I have carried it my whole life instead. The next spring the creek flooded. It does that in the mountains. Comes up in a night from some storm. 2 hollers over that you never even heard. And it came up that spring higher than anyone remembered. And it moved everything. When the water went down the whole bend below, my grandmother's had changed. The deep part was gone. The flood had dragged a mountain of gravel down and dumped it right there in the bowl, filled it in level, and where the swimming hole had been was just a wide stony shallows you could walk across without wetting your knees. The sycamore was gone too, roots and all, torn out and carried off downstream. My grandmother stood looking at it with me and said, "Well, there's the end of your swimming hole." And something in her voice, I've thought about it 50 years. Something in her voice was not sorry, was almost eased, like a thing had been settled that she'd worried at a long while. I never asked her what she meant. I was afraid of the answer, the same as always. I'm an old man now, and I've had a whole life, a good one mostly, and I've told this to no one until now. But I go back to that holler sometimes. My grandmother's place is gone. The house fell in decades back, but the road still runs along the creek, and I've driven it slow more than once, and I always stop at the bend. It's still just dry, stony shallows. All these years later, the creek run thin and ordinary over the gravel. There's nothing to see. Whatever the flood buried is 40 feet down, under a mountain of stone now, and it'll never come up, and that ought to comfort me, and it doesn't. Because here is the thing I've turned over in my mind every night for 50 years. The thing I can't put down. I swam that hole all my boyhood. I dove that dark water 100 times, touched that clay bottom, felt around in the black for the fun of it. And that current, slow as it was always moving. Leaves turned in it, sticks drifted through. Everything in that creek shifted and traveled the way things do in water. But whatever I put my hand on that evening, under the sycamore, it had never once moved in all those years before. Not an inch. It was there that evening, and it had been there every evening I ever swam. Right below me in the dark while I floated, and laughed and loved the mystery of not knowing what was underneath. It stayed. Against the current, it stayed, all that time, in its cloth, keeping its shape, waiting in the one part of the water, where a boy diving for the fun of it would someday, some golden evening, with the cicadas roaring, reach out and lay his hand upon its shoulder. And I have never been able to decide, in 50 years of nights, whether it was waiting for anyone at all, or whether it had only ever been waiting for me. We called it the Basins, though I don't think that was ever its real name, if it had one. It was 3 pools stepped down a long shelf of gray rock, deep in the national forest, one spilling into the next, and the water in them was so clear and so cold, it made your bones ache to stand in it more than a minute. A creek fed the top pool from somewhere up in the Laurel, and the whole thing drained out the bottom one into a run that went off downhill through the trees. You couldn't drive to it. There was a fire road that got you within a couple miles, and then you left the truck at a pull-off and hiked in 40 minutes on a trail that was more suggestion than path, up over a ridge and down the other side into a little hidden bowl of forest where the rock shelf was. Because of that hike, it was always just us. In all the summers we went, I don't think we ever once found another soul at the basins. That was the whole point of the place. That was why we loved it. And that, I've come to think, is also why it was so easy for us to be wrong about being alone. I was 22 that July, and there were 4 of us that made the trip most weekends. Me, my girlfriend Carla, and our friends Doyle and Sish, who were together too and would end up married. We'd load a cooler and towels into my truck on a Friday evening after work and drive out with the windows down, up the fire road in the long light, and hike in with the coolers banging against our legs. And we'd have the basins to ourselves through the whole hot dusk, and sometimes past dark, swimming and drinking a few beers and lying on the warm rock while the light went out of the sky. It was the best of being young, those evenings. I've never had better, and I know now I never will, which is a hard thing, that the best evening of your life and the worst can turn out to be the same one, and you don't know it while it's happening. That evening was like all the others, right up until it wasn't. We got in around 7 with the sun still well up, and we swam, and we laughed, and Doyle did his usual foolishness, jumping from the ledge between the top 2 pools. And the light came down through the trees gold, and then amber, and then that deep honey color it gets right before it goes. The forest around the bowl was thick, laurel and rhododendron grown up in tangles under big hemlocks, dark under there even at midday. And as the sun dropped, that darkness under the trees seemed to rise up out of the ground and gather, the way it does in deep woods, until the tree line all around the clearing was just a wall of black with the pale water glowing in the middle of it and us in the water. It was full of sound, the way those woods always were at dusk, the creek running, the peepers starting up, a whippoorwill off somewhere calling its own name over and over. Ordinary sound, alive sound. I've thought a lot since about the moment that sound changed, and the truth is, I can't put my finger on when it happened. Only that at some point, I became aware that the whippoorwill had stopped, and the peepers had stopped, and there was just the creek running in a silence that had gotten very large. It was Carla who saw them first. She was floating near me in the middle pool, and she went still, and then she swam over close and put her hand on my arm under the water and said, "Lo, not like a joke at all, do you see those people standing at the tree line?" And I looked where she was looking, over at the edge of the clearing, where the trail came down into the bowl, and there were 4 of them, 4 figures, standing at the tree line. Grown people, by the size of them, though it was hard to say more than that, because the light was going, and they stood right at the edge of the dark, under the trees. So they were more shaped in detail, 4 upright shapes, darker than the dark behind them. They weren't swimming. They didn't have towels or coolers or packs. They weren't talking to each other, the way people do when they come up on a place, pointing, deciding. They weren't doing anything at all. They were just standing there in a loose row at the mouth of the trail, facing us, and they were still. Not still the way a person is still the way a fence post is still. Doyle saw them and did the natural thing, the thing you do. He lifted his arm out of the water and waved and called out a hey. It came out too loud in that big silence, and the 4 of them didn't wave back. didn't nod, didn't call anything, didn't shift their weight or turn to one another. Nothing moved. Sish said, kind of nervous, maybe they can't see us good with the light behind us. And Doyle waved again, both arms this time, and hollered hey again. And still there was not one flicker of movement from any of the four. They just faced us out of the dark, under the trees, and the creek ran, and the woods stayed silent. And I felt the cold of that water get into me in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. We told ourselves things. That's what people do, and I understand it now as a kind of animal mercy. The way the mind will build you a little shelter out of ordinary explanations and hurry you inside it. We said they must be hikers who'd come in late and were standing there, deciding whether to come down to the water. We said maybe they were being polite, not wanting to crowd us. We said all that, treading water in a pool going dark, and the whole time some older part of me was counting, and it kept saying, people don't stand like that. People shift. People scratch. People lean and cross their arms and turn their heads to say a thing to the person next to them. A person cannot stand dead still. 4 of them, for 1 minute, let alone the way these stood still as we treaded and talked and told ourselves our little stories. For what had to have been 15-20 minutes, while the last of the honey light drained out of the bowl and the shapes at the tree line went from dark shapes to darker shapes, to hardly more than a suggestion of 4 uprights against the black. We got out. Nobody said, let's go. Exactly. It just happened all at once. The 4 of us moving to the flat rock where our things were, and we gathered our towels and shoved our feet in our shoes and stuffed the cooler, and we did it fast while we joked. That's the part I remember with a particular sick clarity, how we joked. Loud and stupid, laughing too hard. Doyle making some crack about how we'd scared off the shy hikers, all of us grabbing onto the laughing the way you'd grab a rope, because, as long as we were laughing, we didn't have to say the thing, which was that 4 people were standing 30 yards away, in the dark, watching us pack up. And not one of them had moved a muscle in 20 minutes, and we were all 4 of us, in the animal part of us, very badly afraid. The only way out was the trail. The trail came down into the bowl right where they stood. There was no other way. The bowl was ringed with that laurel hell. You couldn't push through in daylight, let alone dark, and a rock face above, and the drainage run below going off into deeper woods. To leave, we had to walk toward them. I remember the 4 of us bunching up, without discussing it, close together, and starting up the slope toward the tree line, with our little flashlights and phone lights bobbing, and I remember I made myself look right at where they stood, made myself keep my eyes on the 4 shapes as we came up on them, because I was more afraid to look away than to look. And as we came up the slope, in the jouncing light, the shapes were not there. There was the tree line. There was the mouth of the trail, going up into the black under the hemlocks. There was no one standing in it. We stopped, all 4 of us, and we shone our lights around, and the light went into the trees and found nothing, just trunks and the wall of laurel and the trail running up empty. Sish made a sound. Doyle said, all casual, all wrong. Well, they must have headed out. They must have gone on up the trail. But that was the thing. That was the thing that took the bottom out of my stomach and has never quite put it back in the 40 years since. Because there was no other way for them to go. The trail was the only way out of that bowl, the one we were standing on, and we'd have seen them go up it. 4 grown people on a narrow trail with their lights. We'd have seen the lights, we'd have heard them, and there'd been nothing, no light, no sound, no one passing us, and the laurel to either side was a solid dark wall. No person could get through, not in the light, not fast, not silent. They had been standing there, and then, In the time it took us to walk up the slope with our eyes more or less on them, they were not standing there, and they had not gone anywhere they could have gone. I did a thing then I've wished I hadn't. I went to the spot. I don't know why. I walked over to where the four of them had stood at the edge of the trees, and I put my light on the ground, and the leaves there were pressed. 4 patches of it, 4 ovals of matted down leaf litter, side by side in a loose row, the way ground looks when something has stood on it a long, long while, longer than 20 minutes, pressed down and packed like a deer's bed, but 4 of them in a row, where 4 people had been standing facing the water. And I did the last thing, the thing I truly wish I hadn't, which was that I crouched and put my hand flat on one of those pressed places. And it was cold. Not cool the way night ground gets. Cold, a deep wrong cold that came up into my palm out of the earth, cold like the bottom of those pools. Cold in a way that the warm July night had no business holding. And I took my hand back, and I did not tell the others, and we hiked out. We hiked out in the dark, not talking. 40 minutes back over the ridge to the truck, 4 of us in a tight knot, lights sweeping the trail, and not one word among us the whole way, because to say a word would have been to make it real. And we drove home with the windows up for once. Doyle and Sish, we never spoke of it. Not once, not in all the years after. Right up till Doyle passed. Some things you bury by agreement. But Carla never came back with me. I went back to the basins a few more times over the years. In daylight, always in daylight, and it was just the pools and the rock and the woods. And I'd tell myself I'd made too much of it. A trick of dusk and beer and being young. But Carla would never go. And one time near the end of us, when I pushed her on it, she told me the thing that had gotten into her and stayed. She said it wasn't that they watched us. Being watched, she said, she could have made her peace with hunters, hikers, whoever. She said the thing she couldn't get out from under, the thing she still dreamed about, was that they had been so patient. That they had stood there in the dark at the only way out, perfectly still, in no hurry at all, and had simply waited. Not for anything to happen. Just waited for us to gather our things and get out of the water and leave. Like the water was theirs. Like we were the thing that didn't belong there, splashing and hollering in a place that was theirs in the dark, and they had only stood at the edge of it, patient as the rock, waiting for us to finish and go so they could have it back. And what she could never stop wondering, she said, the thing that finally kept her from ever going near those woods again, was how many other evenings they had stood there just the same at the tree line. In all those summers we thought the basins were ours and ours alone, and simply hadn't let us see them. My Uncle Emmett ran a small farm at the head of a holler where the road gave out and the woods took over. And the summer I turned 15, my folks sent me to stay with him because they were splitting up and didn't want me in the house while they did it. Nobody said it that way. They said it'd be good for me to get some country air, to work with my hands, to spend time with family. But I knew what I was. I was a thing being moved out of the way of a fire, and I went up that holler in July, sullen and hurting the way only a 15-year-old can hurt, certain the whole world had been arranged to spite me, and I did not expect that summer to leave a mark on me deeper than the one my parents' splitting ever did. But it did. It marks me still. Emmett was my father's older brother, a widower, a quiet man who'd spent so long alone that his words had gone scarce and careful, like a man spending down the last of something he couldn't get more of. He wasn't unkind. He put me to work. There's always work on a farm, fences and feed, and the garden and the 2 milk cows. And he fed me well and left me mostly to myself in the evenings. And I think in his quiet way, he understood better than my parents did. that a hurting boy wants mostly to be let alone and given something to do with his hands. The farm sat in a clearing his grandfather had cut, and on three sides of it, the woods came right up to the fence line. Old woods, the big timber that never got cut back in the holler because it was too far up and too steep to get out. Under those trees, it was dark and cool and quiet even at noon. And back in those woods, maybe a quarter mile up a path behind the barn, there was a pool. Spring-fed, my uncle said, water coming up cold and clean out of the rock. And it had made a pool there maybe 20 feet across, deep in the middle, clear as glass, ringed all around with rhododendron, grown up so thick and tall, it made a kind of green room with the pool for a floor. The family had swum there for generations. My father had swum there as a boy, and his father, and back and back. It was the finest swimming hole I ever saw, cold and clear and secret, and the first evening Emmett showed it to me, I could not wait to get in it. He warned me exactly once. We were standing at the edge of the pool in the last of the light, and I said I'd come down for a swim after chores. And Emmett looked at the water a while, and then he said, in that careful spending way of his, swim in the mornings. Never at dusk. That was all. I waited for the rest of it, the way you wait when a grown person says a thing like that, and there wasn't any rest of it. He just looked at the water, and then turned and went back up the path to the house, and I stood there thinking, old man foolishness, superstition. Every holler's got 100 of them. Don't whistle after dark. Don't sweep the porch at night. Don't kill a spider in the house. I filed it away as one more, and I want you to understand that I wasn't a fool. I was just 15, and grieving, and angry, and when you're that you take a rule, with no reason behind it as a dare. So, of course, within the week, I went at dusk. I told myself it was practical. Days were for work, and I was hot and sore by evening, and the light lasted so long in July that dusk came slow and easy. I went down the path behind the barn with a towel over my shoulder, while the light was going gold and slanting through the timber, and I stripped off and slid into that cold, clear water. And oh, it was fine. It was the finest thing in the world. The cold of it took the ache right out of my worked muscles, and the hurt right out of my chest for a while, and I floated on my back in the middle of the pool and watched the little circle of sky go from gold to rose, to the deep blue of coming night, and the first bats came out and cut across it, flick and gone, hunting the bugs that rose off the water. It was so peaceful. I remember thinking, floating there, that this was the first peace I'd felt since my folks sat me down. I remember being almost happy. I hold on to that, because it's the last clean thing in the memory, the last part before the other part. The crying started from the far bank. It came from the woods just past the wall of rhododendron, on the other side of the pool, close no more than a few yards into the green dark, and it was a child crying. Not a fussing child, not a hurt-knee child. A child crying the way they do when they've been left, that hitching, hopeless, exhausted sob, on and on, the crying of a little one that has cried a long time already and has no hope left in it, but cries anyway, because it's all it knows to do. I stood up in the pool, water to my chest, and my whole body went cold, in a way the spring water hadn't managed. Because there is no sound in this world that hooks into a person deeper than a child crying alone in the dark. It goes past your thinking. It grabs something older than thinking. I called out. Of course I did. I called, "Hey, who's there? You okay?" the way you would, my voice too high, bouncing off the water and the leaves. And the crying stopped, dead, all at once, the way no real crying child could stop, mid-sob, cut off clean. There was a silence then that had a listening in it, a silence that was aware of me, and I stood in that cold water in the last of the light, and I felt watched the way a rabbit in an open field feels the hawk before it ever sees it. Then the crying started again, and it had moved. It came now from off to my left, further around the ring of rhododendron, and it started up right where it had left off. The same hitching sob, the same hopeless little voice. And as I stood there staring at the green dark, it moved again. The crying traveling slow around the far side of the pool. From my left toward the head of it, where the spring came in, circling me, always just past the wall of leaves, always just out of sight. And here is the thing that finally broke the last of my telling myself stories. The thing that turned me from a scared boy into an animal that only wanted out. That rhododendron was a hell of dead branches and dry leaves, the kind of thicket you can't move through without cracking and snapping and thrashing. I'd tried to push into it myself and couldn't go 3 feet quiet. And the crying moved all the way around that thicket, yards and yards of it, and I never heard one single branch break. Not a twig, not a leaf. It moved through that impossible tangle in perfect silence, crying the whole way, a child's grief, traveling through a wall no child could pass, and coming around toward the path. Toward the way out, I got out of that water. I don't remember the swim to the bank or grabbing my clothes. I just remember I was on the path with my towel clutched against me, bare feet on the packed dirt, going up toward the house as fast as I could in the near dark, and behind me and beside me in the rhododendron, the crying came along with me, keeping pace. And as I climbed, it changed. I have tried for 40 years to find the words for how it changed, and I've never gotten it right, but I'll tell you the best I can. The crying began to shape itself. The sobs began to bend, to stretch and pinch off, to try to make sounds that weren't just weeping, and what they were trying to make was my name. It was trying to say my name, but it didn't have it right. It had the shape of it, the rhythm and the rise and fall, like something that had heard my name once, or maybe heard my uncle call it up the holler, and was working at it, sounding it out with a mouth that did not seem to know how a mouth was supposed to go. It came out wrong and wet and stretched, my name pulled like taffy, and put back together crooked over and over, crying and calling and getting each time just a little closer to right. And I ran. I ran up that path and burst out of the woods into the clearing, where the farmhouse windows were lit yellow and warm. And I did not stop till I was inside, with the door shut, standing in the kitchen shaking, dripping, unable to get a word out. Emmett was at the table with his coffee. He looked at me a long moment, at the state of me, and I braced for him to laugh, to call me a fool boy scared of the dark, to say there's nothing down there. He didn't. He didn't call me a liar, and he didn't look surprised. He just nodded, slow, and looked down into his coffee cup, and he was quiet a while, and then he said, in that careful spending voice, "My brother drowned in that pool. Not your daddy, my other brother, older than both of us. He was 17. And I stood there dripping, and he said, it was at dusk. He heard something crying back in the trees, and he went in after it, went in the water toward it, and he never came up. They found him next morning. And I said, what was it, Uncle Emmett? What's down there? And he looked at me, and he didn't answer that. He just said again, real quiet, swim in the mornings, never at dusk. And this time I understood it wasn't superstition. It was the only warning he knew how to give, worn down over 60 years to just those few words, because the rest of it was a thing he couldn't stand to say out loud. I swam mornings after that, the whole rest of that summer, and in the bright morning that pool was the finest thing in the world again, cold and clear and clean, and I never once heard anything in the trees. Not in daylight. Daylight, it was just a swimming hole. But in the evenings, I'd sometimes find myself drawn to the edge of the yard, where the clearing gave way to the timber, and I'd stand there at the fence line with the dark coming down. And after a while, down the path behind the barn, back in the woods where the pool lay, it would start. Faint and patient, and never in any hurry, the crying. And then the crying working itself around, bending and stretching, trying my name, and it was getting better at it. All summer it got better, a little more right each evening, until by August, it could say my name nearly clean, nearly in a voice I might have answered to, calling up soft out of the dark, patient as the spring itself, in no hurry at all, because it had all the time in the world, and only wanted one thing, which was for me to come down to the water at dusk, the way my great-uncle had, the way it was still so gently, so patiently, asking me to. I left at the end of that summer and never went back to my uncle's farm. Emmett passed some years later, and the place went to somebody outside the family, and I've never had the courage to drive up that holler and see it. But I'm an old man now, and my hearing's not what it was, most things gone soft and far. And yet some evenings, when the dark comes down, I'll catch myself standing at a window, still, listening, because I have never quite been able to shake the feeling that it learned my name that summer, learned it clean and whole at last, and that it is patient, and that it is still down there in the green dark, by the cold water, saying it, and waiting for me to finally come. Every kid in our county knew the rope swing at Miller's Bend, and knowing it was a kind of membership, the way knowing a secret handshake is, it hung from a sycamore that leaned out over the river at the deepest bend, a big old tree with half its roots exposed by years of the current gnawing the bank, so it grew out over the water at a lean that looked like it ought to fall and never did. Somebody's father, or somebody's father's father, had thrown a fat knotted rope over the highest limb that would bear it, and there it stayed, replaced every few years when it rotted. Always the same fat rope, with the same big knot at the bottom to sit on, and generations of us had swung out on it into the brown water on hot evenings. It was the center of every summer I had. If you wanted to know where the kids of our county were between supper and dark in July, they were at Miller's Bend, wet and hollering, taking turns on that rope. There was a trick to it, and the trick was the whole thing. The trick was what separated the ones who belonged from the ones who didn't. You grabbed the rope up on the bank, where the sycamore's biggest root made a natural step, and you ran and swung out, and the rope carried you in a long arc out over the river. And at the very top of that arc, at the furthest and highest point, you had to let go. You had to let go right there, because that was the only place you were out over the channel, the deep part, where the water was 10, 12 feet down and clean of rocks. Everywhere else there were rocks. Close into the bank, right under where you started, and where the rope hung at rest, the river was shallow, and the bottom was all broken slabs and round boulders that would break your legs or your back or your skull if you came down on them. So you let go at the top. Every one of us learned it the same way, watching the older kids getting yelled at from the bank. Let go at the top. Let go at the top. Until the timing was in your body, and you didn't even think about it, you just felt the rope reach the top of its swing and go weightless for half a second. And you opened your hands and flew out and dropped into the deep cold channel with the whole county cheering. I'd done it 100 times, 200. It was as natural to me as walking. The evening I have to tell about was late July, the light going long and orange the way it does, the cicadas up in the trees roaring so loud you had to shout over them. There was a good crowd at the bend, a dozen of us maybe, and there was a new kid, Bryce. His family had just moved up from somewhere down in Tennessee, taken the old Harmon place out past the crossroads, And he was at that raw new kid stage, where he stood a little apart and watched and wanted, and so bad you could feel it coming off him. He was maybe 14, a year younger than me, skinny, with a way of laughing a beat too late at things, trying to belong. He'd been coming around a week or so. That evening, he stood on the bank and watched us swing, watched maybe 6 or 8 of us go out and let go at the top, and drop laughing into the channel. And I could see him working up to it, the way you do. When he grabbed the rope, we all did the thing we always did, which was to coach the new one. We yelled it out, all of us, the way it had been yelled at every one of us. Let go at the top. Let go at the top, Bryce. He nodded. He'd heard. He'd watched us do it a dozen times. He knew where the top was. He backed up onto the root step and got a grip on the rope above the knot, and he ran and swung out, and it was a good swing, a strong one, the rope carrying him up and out over the water, in that long, clean arc against the orange sky. I can still see him there. That's the trouble. I can still see him black against that burning sky at the top of the arc, the exact place, the only place, where you let go, and he didn't. He held on. I don't know why. I've turned it over 10,000 times, and I don't know if he froze, if his hands wouldn't open, if some part of him just failed at the last second, the way a body sometimes does. We all saw it, that half second of wrongness, the top of the arc come and go with him, still clinging to the knot. And a kind of groan went up from the bank, because we all knew what it meant. The rope was going to swing him back over the shallows, back over the rocks. We yelled again, different now, scared. Let go, Bryce, the other way. Come back and let go. And the rope reached the top of its backswing right over the rocks and hung him there a second. And he still held on, white-knuckled. And then it swung him out again toward the channel, and I remember thinking, thank God, thank God. This time he'll let go over the deep. This time it'll be all right. And that's when it took him. I have never had a word for what happened, and I've stopped looking for one. He came out over the deep water on that second forward swing, out over the channel, and the rope went taut, straight down. All at once, like a hand had grabbed the knot right under him and yanked like somebody had hung a plow weight off his ankles in midair. The long, easy curve of the swing just stopped, and the rope snapped down into a straight, vertical line, quivering with the strain of it, and Bryce went down that line into the water. Not a jump, not a fall. He was pulled straight down so fast and so hard that he went into the river without a splash. Without a splash. You cannot go into water like that without throwing up a splash. A boy his size dropping in. There ought to have been a plume of it, and there was nothing. Just a clean, dark hole in the surface where he'd gone through, and the rope disappearing into it straight and taut. And then the rope went slack. All the strain went out of it in an instant, and it bobbed up loose and empty, and swung back toward us, slow and stupid, the big knot dripping, and Bryce was gone. For a second nobody moved. The cicadas didn't even stop. That's a thing I still can't get past, that the cicadas roared on exactly the same, that the world didn't so much as hitch, that a boy was pulled straight down into a river by nothing at all. And the evening just went on, being a hot, loud, beautiful July evening, like it hadn't noticed. Then somebody screamed, and we all hit the water. We dove and dove. The channel wasn't but 12 feet at the deepest, and we all knew it like our own backyards. And we dove down into that brown water grabbing for him, for an arm, a leg, anything, and there was nothing. No Bryce. No current strong enough to carry a body off. Not that evening. The river was low and slow with the summer. We dove till our lungs gave out and dove again, a dozen of us, screaming his name between breaths, until it was full dark, and somebody's older brother had run for help, and the men came with lights. The sheriff's men dragged and dove that bend for 3 days. They brought in men from 2 counties and a fellow with diving gear from the city. They found the bottom of that channel, every rock and sunk log of it, and they did not find Bryce. They never found Bryce. Not that week, not that year, not ever. The official word was that he'd drowned, and the body had lodged somewhere, or washed down in a night rise, and his family, God help them, packed up before the summer was out and moved back down to Tennessee. And I have always wondered what it did to them, to lose a boy into a river that then refused to give him back. There was a lot of talk in the county, the way there is. Some said the swing was cursed, and the men cut the rope down and nobody ever hung another. Some said the boy had a bad heart, or hit his head, or got tangled. People built their little shelters of explanation, the same as always, and moved into them. And after a while, Miller's Bend was just a place we didn't go anymore, grown up in weeds, the sycamore still leaning out over the water, with the sawn stub of limb where the rope had been. But I saw something that I never told the sheriff's men, never told my parents, never told a living soul in 50 years, and I'm only telling it now. In the instant, the rope snapped straight down. In that half second before Bryce hit the water, I was looking right at the surface of the channel below him, right at the spot, and the water there dimpled. It pulled inward, all at once, in a ring, a whole circle of little tugs in the surface, the way water dimples when you touch it from below, when something just under the surface breaks up toward the air. A dozen of them, more, a ring of little inward pulls all around the spot where he was about to come down, rising up to meet him. I have spent my life trying to make them into something else. Fish, I've said. A boil in the current, air coming up out of a sunk log. But I know what a thing looks like when it reaches, when fingers break a water's surface from underneath and pull back down, the little dimpling grab of it, and that is what I saw. A ring of hands, just under the surface, breaking up into the last of the orange light for half a second to take him as he came down, and then gone, and then the water smooth, and then the rope slack and empty and swinging, and the cicadas roaring on like nothing at all had happened in the whole wide, beautiful, indifferent evening. I never swam that river again, and to this day, when I pass moving water in the low orange light of a summer dusk, I do not look at the surface of it, because I am afraid, after all these years, that I might see it dimple. The summer of the drought was the summer the reservoir gave up its dead. Though we didn't understand, that's what we were looking at. Not then. We were young, and it was just something strange and exciting to us, a thing to hike down and gawk at. And it took me most of a lifetime to understand what that dry valley had been trying to show us. And by then, it was far too late to do anything but carry it. The reservoir had always just been there, the way the mountains were there, the way the sky was. It filled a long valley, 2 ridges over from where I grew up, 4 miles of green water, with a boat launch at one end and the concrete face of the dam at the other, and we swam in it and fished it and skied behind our uncle's boats on it, and never once, being children, thought about the fact that it hadn't always been there. But it hadn't. The old people knew. The dam had gone up in the 50s, a government project, flood control and electricity, and to make the reservoir, they had flooded a whole valley that people had lived in. A little community down in the bottomland. Some farms strung along the creek, a store, a church, a one-room school, a scatter of houses where families had lived, since before anybody kept records of such things. They bought the people out, or moved them off, and they closed the gates on the new dam, and the water came up slow over the fields, and the roads, and the rooftops, and the church steeple, and the valley, and everything in it that couldn't be carried out went under and stayed under. And after a while, there was nobody left who talked about it. And it was just the reservoir, just water, the way it had always been, until the drought. I was 16 that year, and it didn't rain, not properly, from May clear through August. The creeks ran to strings and then to dry stone. The gardens burned up, and the reservoir began to drop. Slow at first, a muddy ring appearing around the edges like the rim of a dirty tub, and then faster as the summer wore on. And the water table sank until by August it had gone down further than anyone living had ever seen it, 40 feet and more below full. And the shape of the drowned valley began to come back up into the air. You could see the old roadbed running down into the water and out the other side. You could see stone foundations and the humps of what had been fields, and out toward the middle, where the water still lay stagnant and low, the black dead stumps of the trees they'd never cleared before the flooding, a whole drowned forest of them, standing up out of the mud with their roots in the old ground, 60 years dead and preserved down there in the cold and the dark, and now come back to the sun. Word went around, the way it does, and one hot August evening a bunch of us hiked down to see it. 6 or 7 of us, teenagers with nothing else to do, picking our way down the cracked mud slope of the drawn-down reservoir into the exposed valley. It's hard to describe what it was like down in there. The heat sat in that bowl thick as syrup, and the whole place stank, a low, wet, rotten smell. 60 years of drowned muck baking in the sun, the smell of a thing that has been underwater a long time and doesn't want to be up in the air. The mud sucked at our shoes. Everywhere there were the black stumps and the foundations and things half buried in the silt that caught your eye and made your skin crawl once you understood what they were. The ordinary leavings of a place where people had lived. And down in the lowest part of the old valley, where the creek had once run, we found the swimming hole. You could see it was a swimming hole even after 60 years. The creek had pooled there, a wide spot in the old bed where the water had gathered deep. And even now, there was still water in the very bottom of it, a stagnant green pool that hadn't dried up because it was the lowest point in the whole valley. The old bank sloped down to it, and standing there in the reeking heat, you could just see it, the ghost of a summer evening, long before we were born. Kids from that drowned town, swimming in that pool, the same as we swam in the water that had swallowed it. That same eternal thing, children and a swimming hole in August. We stood at the edge of it and looked, and somebody found an old bottle in the mud, thick green glass, and somebody else found the rusted frame of an iron bed sunk in the silt. And we were laughing and calling out fines to each other, 16 and morbid and delighted, treasure hunting in a drowned town. And then we saw the shoes. They were set along the old bank of the swimming hole, half sunk in the gray silt in a row, a long row, shoes, dozens of them, more than dozens. Children's shoes, little ones, the button-up kind from long ago, and bigger ones, men's brogans and women's shoes, all of them gone black and shapeless with their 60 years underwater, but still holding the shape of shoes, still recognizable, still paired, and every single one of them was set pointing the same way, toward the water. A long row of shoes along the bank, all the toes pointed at the green pool, neat, deliberate, ordered. And the laughing stopped among us, one by one, as it got through to each of us what we were looking at. Because a flood doesn't do that. Water rising over a town doesn't set the shoes out in a row along a bank all pointing one way. Silt and current and 60 years scatter things, tumble them, bury them any old way. This was placed. Somebody, before the water ever came, had lined those shoes up along the bank of the swimming hole, every pair, big and small, toes to the water, and left them there for the flood to take. We stood there a long time not saying much, the heat pressing down and the rot smell in our throats, looking at that row of shoes. And it was Dana, a quiet girl. Her people had been in that country longer than anybody's, who finally said the thing low, almost to herself. She said her grandmother had grown up 2 ridges over when the dam went in, and her grandmother would never talk about it. Not the town, not the flooding, not the people who'd lived down here. Dana said she'd asked once, as a girl, why the town let itself go under so easy, why there wasn't any fight in the papers, no holdouts, no lawsuits, none of the fuss you'd expect from people being moved off land their families had held for 100 years. And her grandmother had gone quiet in a way that ended the conversation. And the only thing she'd ever said about it, the one time she said anything at all, was this: that some places people are glad to see covered up. That there are things a community will let a lake be poured over top of, and be grateful for the depth. And then she'd never speak of it again as long as she lived. Nobody had an answer to that. We didn't want one. Whatever those shoes were, whatever had been done at that swimming hole, or found there, or ended there, in the years before the government ever came with its dam. It was a thing the people of that valley had chosen 40 feet of water to bury, and had walked away from without a backward look, and had carried to their graves in silence. We hiked back up, out of that reeking bowl in the failing light, and we didn't treasure hunt anymore, and we didn't talk much, and we came up over the mud rim into the ordinary world of pines and evening, and got in our trucks and went home. I never told my folks where I'd been. I don't think any of us told anybody, really. It wasn't a thing you wanted to have seen. The rains came in September, hard and steady the way they do when a drought finally breaks, and the reservoir began to fill. It came up over the swimming hole and the row of shoes, up over the foundations and the old roadbed, up over the black dead stumps, up and up over 60 years of covered over things, until by the first frost it was full again. 4 miles of green water with the boat launch at one end and the dam at the other, and it was just the reservoir again. Just water, the way it had always been, and people went back to swimming in it and skiing on it and fishing it the very next summer, and they do to this day. My own kids swam in it. My grandkids ski on it now, and I have never once told them what lies under it, because what would I say, and who would believe me, and what good would it do? But I know. That's my burden, and I've carried it 50 years. I know exactly where that swimming hole is. Out from the third cove, past the launch, and I know that 40 feet down in the cold and the dark, that row of shoes is still there, 60 years and 60 more of silt over it now. Big shoes and little shoes, set neat along the old bank with every toe, still pointing at the water, the way somebody placed them the summer before the flood came. And I don't swim in that reservoir. Not off the dock, not off the boat, not on the hottest, stillest day of August, when the whole family's in the water and hollering at me to come in. I sit in the boat and I make my excuses, and I do not put so much as a foot in that green water, because I cannot stop thinking about the deep dark of it under the hull, and the drowned valley waiting patient down there in the cold, and that long row of little shoes, all pointing the same way, toward the water. And I have never been able to decide, in all these years, whether whoever lined them up did it as a burial, or as an offering, or whether the shoes were pointed at the water, because that is the way the children who wore them had gone, walked down into that pool one long ago summer evening and not come back, so that the whole valley agreed to let the lake be poured over top of it, and was glad. I don't know which it is. I've never wanted to know. But I know the water remembers, the way water does, and I know it is patient. And on the hottest day, I keep my feet in the boat. There was a swimming hole off an old logging road that only the local kids knew about, and knowing about it was the kind of thing that made you feel like you were part of something, part of the country itself, in a way the town kids with their chlorine pool at the community center never were. You turned off the state road onto the logging road, which wasn't much more than two ruts with a hump of grass growing up the middle, and you followed it back for the better part of 2 miles through the trees, and then you left your truck at a wide spot and walked the last stretch on foot, down to where the creek had cut a deep pool at the base of a little falls. Flat rocks all around it, warm from the day's sun, perfect for lying out onto dry. Cold, clear water, deep enough in the middle to dive. And nothing else. No houses for miles in any direction. No cell signal. This was back when we were all just getting phones, and out there they were dead weight. No bars, nothing. Just the pool, and the falls, and the flat rocks, and the woods going up all around. And on a summer evening, it was the finest place in the world to be young and free, and away from every grown eye that might tell you no. There were 7 of us that ran together that summer, the summer I was 17. Me and Tara, who I was halfway in love with and never told. Danny, my best friend since grade school, and 4 others, whose names don't matter to the story except that there were 7 of us, and I want you to hold on to that number, because the number is the whole thing. 7. We'd pile into 2 trucks after supper and drive out the logging road, and spend the long July evenings at the pool, swimming and lying on the rocks, and talking the way you do at that age, about everything and nothing, about getting out of that county, and about never wanting to leave it, both at once. Those evenings are the best thing I have. I've had a good life since, but I've never again been as purely happy as I was on those warm rocks with those 6 people, and the falls going, and the light coming down gold through the trees. The first evening the man came, it was full 7 of us. We heard him before we saw him, the crunch of boots on the gravel of the logging road coming down from the direction of the trucks. And we all looked up, because you did, out there, when you heard another person. But it was nothing alarming. Hunters used that road, and hikers sometimes, and old-timers who'd worked the timber back when it was cut, and liked to walk it still. He came down out of the trees into the clearing, by the pool, an older man, maybe 60, clean-shaven, with gray hair combed back neat, and the only thing off about him at all was that he was dressed too warm. It was July, 90 degrees even in the evening, and he had on a buttoned coat, a heavy dark coat done up to the throat, the kind of thing you'd wear in November. But even that you could explain. Old people run cold. My own grandfather wore a sweater in August. So we nodded to him the way you do, friendly, and went back to what we were doing, and figured he'd nod back and walk on down the road, or maybe fish a while. He didn't walk on. He crossed to the far side of the pool, to the flat rocks over there, and he sat down on them, facing us across the water, and he watched us. And that, too, wasn't so strange at first. An old man come to sit by the water on a summer evening and watch the young folks swim, remembering when he was young himself. There's nothing sinister in that. It's one of the gentlest things there is. But he didn't smile. He didn't call anything across to us, didn't ask were the fish biting, or tell us to be careful of the deep part. None of the things an old-timer says to kids at a swimming hole. He just sat, with his coat buttoned to his throat in the heat, and watched, and after a while I noticed his lips were moving. It was Tara who put words to it. She swam over close to me and said, "Quiet, has that man been talking to himself this whole time?" And I looked, and his lips were going, just barely, and his eyes were moving. That was the thing. His eyes moved from one of us to the next, slow and deliberate, touching each of us in turn. Danny on the rock, then me in the water, then Tara, then the others, one by one around the whole group of us. And his lips ticked with each one, and then his eyes went back to the start and did it again. And once Tara had pointed it out, I could not stop seeing it, could not unsee it. The way his gaze moved 1, 2, 3 around the 7 of us, and his lips counted along, and then reset and counted again, over and over. He was counting us, slow and patient and certain, counting us like a man counting cattle through a gate, or coins into a jar, going around and around the 7 of us as the light failed, and never once did his face change, and never once did he stop. It got under all of us after a while, though nobody wanted to be the one to make it a big deal. We kept swimming, kept talking, but the ease had gone out of the evening, and we found ourselves glancing across the water at him, and he was always counting, always. His eyes moving, and his lips ticking. When it got dark enough that the rocks had lost the day's warmth, and the first stars were coming, we started gathering our towels, the evening breaking up on its own, the way they did. And the moment we stood up to go, the very moment, like he'd been waiting for it, the man stood up too. He didn't say anything. He didn't nod goodbye. He just rose from the far rocks and turned and walked back up the logging road the way he'd come, into the dark, under the trees, and was gone. We laughed about it in the trucks going home, the way you do, making him into a character, the weird old counting man. But Tara said something that stuck a splinter in me and never came out. She said, still half lawing, but not quite. He counted us like he was making sure we all left, and I laughed too, but I was thinking about it, and the thing was, He'd counted us the whole evening, and he'd waited, and only when all 7 of us stood up to go had he been satisfied enough to leave himself. Like a man doesn't leave the gate till he's got a count on every head. Like he was responsible for us, somehow, or responsible for something about us. It bothered me more than I let on, and it bothered Tara too. I could tell, though we both made light of it, because what else do you do? We went back the next weekend, of course we did. It was our place, and one strange old man wasn't going to change that. And by the next Friday, we'd mostly talked ourselves into him being harmless, a lonely old fellow, sad more than scary. But there were only 6 of us that evening, because Danny had gotten a summer job at the feed store, and had to work Friday evenings now, and so we were 6 instead of 7 when we walked down the logging road to the pool. And the man was there. He was sitting on the far rocks in the same buttoned coat, in the same July heat, like he had never left, like he'd been sitting there the whole week, waiting for us to come back. And when we came into the clearing and settled on the rocks, his eyes started moving and his lips started ticking, the count going around the same as before. But this time, I watched him do it, watched him from the start, and I saw the moment his count came up wrong. His eyes went around us, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and stopped and went back and did it again, slower, and stopped again at 6, and his face changed. It was the only time all those 2 evenings that his face changed at all, and I have never forgotten it, because what came into it was not confusion exactly, but something worse, something like alarm, like a man who has counted his children through the door in a fire and come up one short. He frowned, deep, and he stood up, and he looked down the logging road. He turned his head and looked back up the road, the way we'd come, the way you'd walk in from the trucks, off into the dark under the trees. And he looked a long moment, searching, like he expected to see somebody coming, and there was nobody. And then he looked back at us, at the 6 of us gone very still and quiet on the rocks, watching him, and his lips moved, and this time it wasn't counting. This time it was one word, and he made it big and slow and clear, mouthing it across the water so there could be no mistake, and I read it clean off his lips from 30 feet away. He mouthed, "Where?" Just that. Where? Looking right at us, at the gap where the seventh of us should have been, and asking the empty air, the dark road, the six of us who couldn't answer. Where? Where is the other one? Where did the seventh go? We didn't stay. We were up and grabbing our things without a word spoken among us, and we went up that logging road fast, too fast, bunched together, not running but wanting to. And behind us I did not hear him follow, but I did not hear him stay either, and I did not look back to see. We got in the trucks and we drove out, and we did not go back. Not that summer, not ever. Nobody had to say, "Let's not go back." We just didn't. The place that had been the best place in the world was closed to us now, and we let it close. And we found other things to do with our last weeks before school started. And we did not talk about the counting man, and after a while, it went down under the surface of that summer the way things do. But I'll tell you what I think about all these years later. I think about how glad I am that Danny had that job. Because Danny was the seventh, Danny was the one who wasn't there. The evening the count came up short, Danny was where the old man was asking after, with that terrible frown on his face, looking down the dark road for someone who hadn't come. And nothing ever happened to Danny. That's the thing I have to say plain, so you understand. There's no neat ending here. No body, no tragedy, nothing you could point to. Danny grew up and married and moved to Ohio, and we still trade calls at Christmas. And he's fine, he's always been fine. Nothing came of it. The old man asked where, and got no answer. And we ran, and life went on. And that is the whole of what happened. And it should be nothing. It should be a funny story about a strange old man at a swimming hole. But I have never been able to make it nothing. Because I saw his face when the count came up. 6. I saw that it mattered to him, mattered more than anything. That all of us be there, be accounted for, and I have spent my life half afraid of what it would have meant if the count had come up short a different way. Not because one of us was safe at a feed store, but because one of us had walked down that road and into that water and not walked back out. I think he was counting to be sure. I think that was his whole purpose, whatever he was, sitting there in his November coat in the July heat, counting the young folks in and counting them back out, making sure the same number that came down the road went back up it. And I think the evening the count came up short, he didn't know yet that it was only the feed store. He thought, for one moment, that the water had finally taken one. And the frown on his face, the wear on his lips, was the look of a man who had been keeping that count a very long time, and had just, for the first time, come up one soul short. The falls were the whole reason people came. And I understand that, because a falls is a spectacle, and the human animal is drawn to spectacle. 30 feet of white water, dropping off a ledge of dark rock into a plunge pool at the bottom that churned and boiled, and threw up spray you could feel on your face from the bank. The brave ones jumped it, climbed out along the ledge at the top, and leapt out past the falling water into the deep churn below, and came up whooping to the cheers of everybody watching. I never jumped it. I never had the nerve, and I'm glad now I never did. Though for different reasons than the ones that kept me on the bank as a boy. The plunge pool at the bottom of the falls was where the crowds were, the families and the daredevils and the coolers and the noise, and that was never the part of that river I loved. The part I loved was above the falls. You had to know it was there. You climbed a path up alongside the falls, up the steep rock beside all that falling white water, and at the top the river came out of the woods and did a thing that I have never seen another river do quite the same way. It went calm, Just above the drop, for a stretch of maybe 40 yards before the ledge, the river widened out and slowed and went deep, and the surface of it turned to glass, dark green glass, so still and so smooth you could see the sky laid out on it, perfect, the clouds and the tops of the trees. A quiet pool at the very lip of all that violence. You could stand up there in the stillness and see the water slide, silent and unhurried, toward the edge, and then just past the edge, it became the roar and the white and the spray. But up in the pool itself, it was silent, glassy, peaceful as a held breath. I loved it more than any place I knew. I loved the strangeness of it, that a river could be so calm right at the edge of throwing itself off a cliff. My father took me up there the first time, when I was small, and he taught me the thing I've carried my whole life. He was a quiet man, a careful man, and he stood with me at the edge of that glassy pool, and he didn't let me get in. Not that day. He just made me stand and look at it. And he said, "You see how still it is. You see how it doesn't hardly seem to move." He said, "That's the most dangerous water on this whole river, right here. And it's dangerous because it's the most peaceful looking. Down there in the plunge pool, it looks dangerous, and it is. And because it looks it, people respect it. But up here," he nodded at the glass, "up here the water that looks the safest is water that's already decided where it's going." And I didn't understand him, not really, not for a long time. I just heard it, the way a boy hears his father's warnings, filed away half understood. The water that looks the safest is water that's already decided where it's going. He wouldn't let me swim there until I was near grown. And even then he made me stay close to the bank. And even then I could tell it cost him something to watch me in it, that some fear lived in him about that pool that he never fully put into words. I was in my 20s before I understood what he meant, and I understood it all at once. On an evening I have spent the rest of my life trying to explain to myself and never have. My father was gone by then, past the winter before, and I think that's partly why I went up there alone that evening. Some need to be in a place that was his, to stand where he'd stood. It was a weekday evening, late, and the crowds had all gone home from the plunge pool below. And I climbed the path up, alongside the falls in the long gold light, and came out at the top. And the upper pool was mine alone, glassy and green, and perfectly still, the sky laid out on it. I should have heard my father's voice in my head, and I did. But I was grown and grieving, and a little reckless with it, and I got in. The water was cool and deep, and I swam out to the middle of the pool and floated on my back, the way I loved to, looking up at the sky going from gold to rose, and letting the current carry me, because there was a current, even up in the calm. Not much. A slow, lazy turning, the water moving in a wide, unhurried circle in the pool before it slid off toward the falls. And if you floated in it, it would carry you gently around. A slow, easy circle, round and round. And I had done this 100 times. Let the pool turn me while I watched the sky. It was the most peaceful thing in the world. I floated, and the water turned me slow, and I thought about my father. And I let the grief move through me the way you have to. And the light faded, and I lost track of time the way you do when you're floating and hurting and half dreaming. And then I noticed the circle had changed. It's hard to say when I first felt it, because it came on so gradual, so gentle, that for a while my mind explained it away. But the lazy wide circle the pool had been turning me in had gotten smaller, tighter, and it had shifted. The far edge of the pool, the downstream edge, the lip where the glassy water slid silent over the rock and became the falls. That edge was closer than it had been. Closer than it should have been. I'd been floating in the middle, in the safe center of the slow turning, and now the middle wasn't where it had been. The whole circle had drifted downstream toward the drop, and tightened, and I was riding the near rim of it toward that silent sliding edge, and I had not chosen to move at all. I hadn't kicked, hadn't paddled, hadn't done anything but float. The water had done it. The water had carried me, so slow and so gentle, I never felt the decision of it, closer and closer to the place where it went over. I turned over and swam for the bank. Not panicked yet, just done with floating, wanting my feet under me. And this is the part I have never been able to make sensible, the part I've turned over 10,000 nights. I swam for the near bank, a good strong stroke, and the water let me get close. Close enough to see the individual roots in the bank, close enough to reach, and then it drew me back. Gently. It pulled me back away from the bank toward the center of the pool, against my stroke, against the whole logic of moving water. Because water in a pool above a falls moves toward the falls, that's the only way it can move, downstream, toward the edge. And this pulled me back upstream and inward, back toward the middle, the way you draw something back to you across a table with your fingertips, slow, testing. That's the only word I have for how it felt, like a hand had closed around me under the water and drawn me back, not hard, not yet, just a gentle, steady pull to see. I have always felt, to see whether I would fight. I fought. I swam for the bank again, harder, and again it let me get within arm's reach, and then drew me back. And I want to be as clear as I know how to be, because this is the thing nobody believes, and I've stopped telling. It pulled me against the current. Twice. 3 times. The falls were downstream to my right, and the bank was to my left, and the water kept drawing me back away from the bank, upstream and toward the center, which is a direction. Water does not go, cannot go. There was no eddy that made sense. No logic of hydraulics my father, or anyone could have drawn me a picture of. It simply took hold of me and drew me back, gently, each time I made for the bank, the way you might draw back a child who keeps trying to get down from your lap, patient, not yet using any real strength, just enough to say, no, not yet, stay. And all the while, downstream, I could hear the falls, that endless patient roar, waiting. I got out because of a root. On the 3rd or 4th try, my hand closed on a tree root that came down into the water off the bank, thick and strong, and I hauled on it, and the water did not let go of me easily. I hauled myself half up the bank with my arms, while my legs were still out in the pool being tugged, and I could feel it, the pull on my legs, drawing them not toward the falls, but straight back out toward the center of the pool, straight and steady and strong now, no longer gentle, as if once it saw, I meant to leave it stopped, being gentle, and I kicked and clawed and dragged myself up over that root onto the mud of the bank and lay there, and my legs came free all at once, and I lay in the mud shaking with the whole lower half of me soaked and cold, and the pool lying there behind me, gone glassy and still again, innocent, peaceful, the sky on it, like nothing at all had happened. I lay on that bank a long time, until full dark. I didn't have it in me to move for the longest while, and I lay there listening to the falls, go on and on downstream, patient and endless. The sound they'd been making before I was born, and would go on making after I was gone, and I understood my father at last, understood him all the way down. The water that looks the safest is water that's already decided where it's going. That glassy, calm pool wasn't calm because it was safe. It was calm because it had already made up its mind, already chosen its direction, already committed every drop of itself to going over that edge, and it moved you toward that going with a patience so gentle and so total that you'd never feel the decision being made about you until it was already made. My father knew. Some fear had lived in him about that pool his whole life, and now it lived in me. I have never swum above a falls again. Not that one, not any. I don't go near the calm water at the top of a drop. and I've made my peace with most of it, with the strangeness and the not understanding. The way you have to make peace with things that happen to you that don't fit in the world you thought you lived in. But there's one part I have never made peace with, and it's not the part where the water decided against me. I can almost understand that. The water had decided where it was going, and for a while it decided I was going with it. And that's terrible, but it's of a piece with what my father taught me. It fits. What doesn't fit, what I lie awake on, is the end of it. Because that water had me. 3 times it had me, drew me back, tested me. And the last time it took my legs straight and strong and meant it, and there was no reason on this earth I should have made that bank. And then, for no reason I have ever been able to find, it let me go. It changed its mind. The water that had already decided where it was going, that my father swore never changed and never spared, changed its mind about me that evening, and let me haul out onto the mud and live. And I don't know why. I have never known why. And what haunts me is not that the water is patient and endless and has already decided. My father taught me that, and I believe it. What haunts me is that it can change its mind, which means it has one. And I felt it thinking, that evening, in the slow, gentle testing pull of it, felt it deciding and then deciding again. And I have never been able to stop wondering what it is, up there in the calm above the falls, that lies so still and looks so peaceful and thinks. Deep in the woods off Route 9, there was a swimming hole the locals just called the tank. And I've thought a long time about how to tell this, because it's the one that took my brother, though it took him slow, over 30 years, the way some poisons do. You had to know the tank was there to find it. There was no sign, no trail to speak of, just a place along Route 9, where you pulled off onto the shoulder by a certain leaning fence post and went into the trees. And if you knew the way, you'd walk back through the woods, the better part of a mile, downhill, following the sound of water, until you came to it. It was a strange piece of country down there. A creek had cut down through the rock, over I guess 10,000 years, and made a deep round pool at the base of a low cliff, a rock overhang that leaned out over the water, so that half the pool was in shadow under the stone, even at midday. The water in it was spring-fed and black-green and cold, colder than any water has a right to be in July, cold enough that the old-timers said the tank had no bottom, that it went down into the rock further than anybody'd ever dived. Round as a bowl, deep, still, shadowed under that overhang. The tank. It was a good name for it. It felt like a thing that held something. My brother Wade was 2 years older than me, and the bravest person I ever knew, and the summer this happened. I was 16, and he was 18, his last summer before he went off to the service. We'd been going to the tank since we were boys, and that evening we hiked in late, the two of us, with the light already going amber up in the tops of the trees, though it was still dim and green down in the woods. We came down the last of the slope toward the water, and we heard voices before we saw the pool. Children's voices. Kids playing in the water, that high echoing sound of it. And Wade and I looked at each other, because that was strange right off. Not that kids would swim at the tank, but it was a mile of hard woods from the road, downhill all the way, and there were no houses anywhere near, no farms, nothing for miles in any direction. It was no place for little children to be, and certainly no place for them to be alone. But alone they were. We came out at the pool, and there were 3 of them, 3 children, swimming in the tank, 2 boys and a girl, somewhere between 8 and 10 years old, hard to say. And the first thing that was wrong, the first of many things, was that they were swimming in their regular clothes, not swimsuits. The girl in a plain dress, the boys in trousers and shirts, all of it, soaked and clinging, like they'd just walked into the water dressed as they were, and there was no sign of anybody else. No towels laid out on the rocks, no shoes, no bikes leaned against the trees, no packs, no cooler, no grown person sitting anywhere watching them. Nothing. 3 children, a mile back in the woods from the nearest road, swimming in their clothes in water, cold enough to stop your heart. And not one sign of how they'd gotten there or who'd brought them. They saw us, and they were friendly. That's what makes it hard to explain what was wrong, because nothing they did was unfriendly or frightening in any way you could point to. They said hello. They smiled. They asked our names, and we told them, and they told us theirs. Though I couldn't tell you now what they said their names were. It's like the names went into me and found nothing to hold on to and slid back out. They were friendly, and they were wrong, and it took me a while, wading in that cold, shallow water at the edge, to start naming the wrongness to myself. It was little things. It was that they didn't shiver. Wade and I were up to our knees, and already the cold of that water was in our bones. We were both of us shivering, and saying how cold it was the way you do. And these 3 children had been in it, fully in it, swimming, and they weren't cold at all. No goosebumps on the girls' bare arms, no blue in their lips, no shaking. They moved through that frigid black water, easy and warm, as if it were a bath, and it was that they didn't blink. Not never, but not right, not enough. They'd look at you with those wet, shining eyes for too long a stretch without blinking, and then blink all at once and go back to staring, and it was the way they moved in the water. Smooth, unhurried. Together, somehow, in a way children playing aren't, like 3 parts of one thing. Wade felt it too. I could see it come over him, the bravest person I knew, a kind of wariness settling into his shoulders. And Wade, being Wade, did the sensible thing, the grown thing, which was to try to sort out the situation. He asked them, friendly as he could, "Where's your folks at? Who brought you kids out here?" And the 3 of them stopped their easy moving in the water, and went still, all 3 at once. And they turned their faces toward my brother, and then all 3 of them lifted an arm and pointed. The same arm, the right arm, the same smooth motion, at the exact same instant, 3 children pointing as if one body moved them, and they pointed up at the rock overhang, up at the dark underside of that stone, leaning out over the deep-shadowed half of the pool. And they didn't say anything. They just held that point, all 3, arms up toward the overhang, faces turned to Wade. Not smiling now, not anything, just pointing up at the black underside of the rock, where there was nothing to see but shadow, and holding it until it was more than I could stand. We decided to leave. Wade said something easy. "Well, we better get on." Getting dark, and we backed up out of the water and started gathering the little we'd brought. And as we did, the girl swam over toward our side, to the edge nearest us. And she looked up at me with those wet, unblinking eyes, and she asked, "Are you coming back tomorrow evening?" Just like a normal child would ask, hopeful, wanting playmates. And I didn't know what to say, so I said what you say. I said maybe. Maybe, we'll see. And she smiled at me. It was a sweet smile, and it was the worst thing that happened the whole evening. Worse than the pointing, because of what she said with it. She smiled up at me out of that cold black water, and she said, "Everybody comes back." And then, still smiling, certain, patient as anything. That's how it works. We left. We went up the slope into the woods faster than the climb really wanted, both of us quiet. And we were maybe 100 yards up when Wade, behind me, made a sound, a small sound, like the air got knocked out of him. I asked what, and he didn't answer right off. And then he said, "Low, don't look back, keep walking, don't look back," and I didn't. To this day, I don't know if I'm grateful for that, or if it's the great regret of my life. But I didn't look back. I kept walking, and I got us up that slope and out to the road in the last of the light. And it wasn't till we were in the truck with the doors shut that Wade told me what he'd seen. He said he'd glanced back, just once, down at the pool through the trees before it went out of sight, and the three of them had been standing on the water. Not in it, on it. Out in the middle of the tank, over the deepest part, where the old-timers said there was no bottom. The three children had been standing on the surface of the black water. Upright, easy, not sinking, standing on it like it was a floor, and watching us go, watching us climb away up through the trees. That's what Wade saw, and he was the bravest and most level person I ever knew, and he was white as the moon telling it, and he never once in all the years after took it back, or softened it, or said maybe he'd been mistaken. He saw them standing on the water, watching, and I did not look, and I have been glad my whole life that I did not look, and I have also never stopped wondering what it would have done to me if I had. We never went back to the tank. Neither of us. That part was easy. You couldn't have dragged either of us down that slope again for any money. Wade went off to the service at the end of that summer, and I went on with my own life, and the years went by the way they do, and the tank became a thing we didn't talk about, one of those sealed rooms between brothers. But every so often, on a summer evening, Wade would call me, or later, when we were both grown and settled, he'd bring it up quiet at the end of a visit, and he'd tell me he'd been dreaming of the pool again. He said it came in summer mostly, on the warm evenings. He'd dream of the tank, the black water under the overhang, and he'd wake up in the dark with his heart going, and the girl's voice still in his ears, clear as if she were in the room, sweet and patient and certain. Everybody comes back. That's how it works. He carried it his whole life. 30-some years he carried that little girl's voice, and it never quite let him go, and I think now it was never meant to. I think that evening we walked out owing something, and the debt just sat there, patient as the water, waiting. My brother passed a few summers ago. I'll tell you how, though I've never told it right to anyone, because there's no way to tell it that doesn't sound like a thing I made up, and I didn't make up a word of it. He drowned. Wade, who swam like a fish his whole life, who'd been through the service, who was as strong and sure in the water at 60 as he'd been at 18. He drowned on a summer evening in the backyard pool of a friend's house, a shallow, ordinary suburban pool with people not 30 feet away. Nobody saw it happen. Nobody heard a splash or a call. One minute he was there at the cookout, and the next somebody looked over, and he was at the bottom of the deep end, at the bottom of 8 feet of clear, chlorinated water, and by the time they got him up, he was gone. There was no reason for it. No heart attack, the doctors said. No stroke, no cramp they could find. Nothing wrong with him at all that should have kept a strong swimmer down in 8 feet of water on a summer evening. The coroner wrote down drowning because there wasn't another word to write, but he told the family privately he couldn't explain it, that men like my brother don't just sink and stay. No one could explain how. And I didn't try to explain it to any of them, because what would I have said? But I knew. I knew the moment they told me it was a summer evening and it was in the water. I knew that after 30-some years the account had finally been settled, and that somewhere, whether at the bottom of that friend's ordinary pool or in the black, bottomless dark of the tank off Route 9, a little girl in a wet dress had been proven right. Everybody comes back. That's how it works. And I'm an old man now, and it's summer again as I tell you this, and the evenings are warm, and I find that I have started to dream of the pool. This is the one I've never told, not to my wife in 51 years of marriage, not to my children, not to the preacher, not to a living soul, and I'm telling it now, only because I'm old, and I've come to believe I don't have long. And I'd like it out of me before I go, the way you'd like to set down a stone you've carried so long you've forgotten it isn't part of you. My name doesn't matter. What matters is a swimming hole called Coldwater, and what happened to me there the summer I was 17, and what I've slowly come to understand happened, which is a different thing, and worse. Coldwater was a swimming hole up a hollow a few miles from the town I grew up in, and it was rightly named. A creek came down off the mountain there and gathered in a deep basin at the foot of a rock face, and that basin was fed from underneath by springs, cold springs coming straight up out of the mountain's heart, so that, no matter how hot the summer got, the water at Coldwater stayed cold enough to take your breath. The top of it might warm a little in the sun by afternoon, but you only had to dive down a few feet to hit the cold coming up, and below that, it went colder and darker than you'd think water could go, down and down into the dark of the basin, where the springs fed in and where, the old people said, there was no true bottom, only the cold, going down forever into the rock. It was a beautiful place, and a feared place both, the way the best swimming holes always are. Every summer the boys of the county swam there, and every few summers Coldwater took one, and the two facts live side by side in everyone's mind, without ever quite touching, the way such facts do when you're young, and it's hot, and the water is right there. The summer I was 17 was my last summer at home. I'd signed up already. I was to leave for the service in September, and I had that feeling a boy has at the edge of leaving everything he's known, that ache that's half grief and half wild freedom. And I spent that summer trying to soak up every last drop of the place before I left it. We swam at Coldwater near every evening, a whole crowd of us, and it was the finest summer of my life, right up until the evening it nearly became the last one. It was late in the day, the light already going, that gold-turning amber light of a summer dusk, and the others had had enough and were climbing out, gathering their things, heading up the trail toward where the trucks were parked. I told them I'd be right behind. I wanted one more. That was all it was, that small ordinary wanting, one more swim in the cold water before the dark came, and it near cost me everything. I swam out alone into the deep part, out over the dark, where the springs fed in, and I dove down into the cold, the way I'd done 10,000 times. And coming up, without any warning at all, the cramp took me. If you've never had a real cramp in deep water, I can't make you understand it. It's not a pain you can push through. It's a betrayal. My whole right leg seized from the hip down, the muscle knotting up hard as wood, and the leg just quit, went rigid and useless and screaming, and I was out over the deepest part of Coldwater, with one leg and the cold pulling the strength out of the rest of me by the second. I tried to call out. I got a little sound out, not much, and the others were up in the trees by then, laughing, not listening, moving away. I went under, came up thrashing with my arms, got a breath, went under again. And the third time I went down, I didn't come back up, because the cramp and the cold and the panic had used up everything I had, and I felt myself sinking, down into the dark and the cold, and I knew, with a clear, cold certainty that was almost peaceful, that I was drowning, that this was how it happened, that I was going to be the one Coldwater took that summer. I remember the panic, and then I remember the panic leaving. They say that happens at the end, that the struggle gives way to a kind of quiet, and it's true, I felt it. The fight went out of me, and a stillness came, and I hung there in the cold, dark water going down, done. And it was in that stillness, at the very bottom of it, that I felt the hands, under my arms, under my back, coming up from below me, from the dark deep, where there was no bottom, pressing up against me and lifting. Many of them. I want to be careful and exact, because I've had 64 years to be sure of what I felt, and what I felt was hands, human hands, more than two, more than four, pressing up under my arms and my back and the backs of my legs and lifting me, gently, steadily, up through the cold toward the surface. They were not rough. They did not grab or claw. They cradled me, is the only word. Cradled me up out of the dark like you'd lift a sleeping child, and I broke the surface, and my mouth opened, and I dragged in air, alive, gasping, and the hands did not let go. They held me up on the surface where I could breathe, and then they moved me. They towed me, slow and gentle and sure, through the water toward the shallows, the near bank where the sandy shelf was, and all the while I could feel them under me, patient, careful, bearing me up, and I could not see a single one. The water was clear and the light not yet gone, and I looked and there was nothing, no one, no arms, no faces, nothing in the water with me at all, only the unmistakable press of many hands holding me up and carrying me in. They brought me to the sandy shelf and set me down in the shallows, gently, on my hands and knees in a foot of water, and then they were gone, the press of them lifting away all at once. And I knelt there in the shallows, coughing the water out of my lungs, alive, alone, saved. I told no one. When the others missed me and called back down the trail, I hollered that I was coming, and I climbed out and joined them, and I never said a word about what had happened out there in the deep, because even at 17, even in the first rush of being alive, when I'd been sure I was dying, some part of me understood that it was not a thing to say out loud. I went home. I left for the service in September, and for a long, long time I told myself it had been a miracle. That's the word I used, in the private place where I kept it. A miracle. That there was some good thing in the water, at cold water. Some guardian, some mercy, and that for reasons I'd never know it had chosen to save me when it might have let me drown. I held that belief close for years. It comforted me. Through the war and after it, through everything the world did to me, and everything I did in it, I carried the secret knowledge that once, when I was a boy, unseen hands had lifted me out of the dark, and it made me feel, I suppose, that I was meant for something, that I'd been spared for a purpose. I believed that a long time. I don't believe it anymore. And the reason I don't is the dreams. Because every summer since that one, every single summer of my life, on the warmest evening of the year, and I have never been able to explain how I know which evening that will be. But I always know, I feel it come, the year's deepest heat settling in at dusk. Every one of those evenings, I dream of cold water. I'm back in the deep water at dusk, with the light going gold, and the hands are under me, holding me up, just as they did. But in the dream, I understand what I did not understand as a boy. In the dream, I can feel that the hands never left. That's the thing. In the waking memory, they set me in the shallows and lifted away. But in the dream, I know the truth the memory hid from me, which is that they never let go at all, that they have been under me my whole life, all these years, bearing me up, patient, waiting. And the dream always ends the same way. It ends with the hands, so slowly, so gently, beginning to change what they are doing, beginning to press down instead of up, beginning after all this time, so patient, so sure, to pull me down instead of holding me up. And I always wake right there, right as the dark water closes back over my face, wake in my bed, sweating with my old heart hammering, on the warmest night of the summer, every summer, for 64 years. I've come to understand it, you see. Slowly, over a lifetime, I've come to understand what happened to me at Coldwater, and it is not what I told myself as a boy. They did not save me, or they did, but saving me was not a mercy, or not only a mercy. I think that whatever is down there in the cold and the dark, where there is no bottom. Whatever hands came up to bear me toward the air that evening, they did not spare me my death. They only lent me the years between. I think they held my death for me, kept it, the way you'd hold something for a person who wasn't ready to take it yet, and I think everything I have had since. The war I came home from, the woman I married, the children, the whole long, good, ordinary life, the 51 years, all of it. I think every bit of it has been borrowed, held up out of the dark on those patient hands, and that a debt like that does not go unpaid. Everybody comes back to the water. I didn't know that as a boy. I know it now. I'm 81 years old. My heart is failing. The doctor has told me so, in the gentle, careful way they tell you. And I've made my peace with most of it, the way you do. But I'll tell you the thing that I have not made my peace with, the thing that has me telling this at last, after a lifetime of silence. The dreams have changed. It used to be only the one warmest night of the summer. But this past while, these last weeks, they've been coming most every night. Warm or cool, coming again and again, and in them, the hands are no longer so gentle. They're insistent now. They don't wait for the slow, soft turning at the end anymore. They start pressing down, almost as soon as the dream begins, down and down, more urgent each night, as though whatever has held my death for me all these years has grown tired of holding it, as though the loan has at last come due and is being called in. I woke last night with the water already at my lips in the dream, and the hands pushing hard, and I lay there in the dark a long time, an old man in a dry bed, and I could not shake the feeling. I cannot shake it now, even awake, even telling you this in the plain light of day, that they mean to be paid back this summer, that my time of walking around up here in the air is nearly spent. And I'll tell you the last of it, the thing I'm most afraid to say, and so I'll say it and be done. I have started, these last few days, to hear the water. Not in dreams. Awake, sitting in my chair by the window in the afternoon, in the quiet of the house I hear it, faint and far off and cold, the sound of a creek gathering in a deep stone basin, the small lapping sound of cold water at dusk, and it is getting closer, and it is patient. And I think this summer, on the warmest evening, I will finally go down to it, and the hands that have held me up so long and so gently will at last so gently take me home.